It's my great pleasure to introduce Anne Bogart, who's one of the great visionary artists of our time. Her work with the City Company, she's a professor at Columbia University, she's a writer, she's influenced a generation of theatre practitioners. Many of you in the audience tonight likely have some connection to her and her work. She Actors Theatre and the Humana Festival have had the pleasure of hosting Anne and the City Company for numerous works over the last 20 years. She's a generous, thoughtful, incredibly brilliant artist. She's a pal of mine, and I'm delighted to welcome her to the stage, Anne Bogart.
I'm coming over here for visual variety. If you get tired of this, I'll go over there. So I will say, Les, where are you? He's the devil. I can't remember if he called me or emailed, but I've lost track of how we communicate with one another these days. And he asked me to give this keynote address. And he said, but there's a caveat in that if you do it, you have to use the following title, a call to action. And I took a deep breath, and I said, okay. And it was definitely a gauntlet thrown down, and I had to work really hard on this call to action. It's not something one takes lightly. So, but the first thing I had to do is to actually find out what a call to action is. And my stepdaughter, who's actually in marketing in theater in London, laughed at me when I said, what's a call to action? Because apparently it's used in marketing. Probably most of you know that. So I did a little research, and apparently it's called a CTA, Les. And it's an instruction to the audience designed to provoke an immediate response. So apparently, if you do a CTA, you have to do 4 things, which I've tried to do. 1, use a strong command verb to start your CTA. For those in marketing, this is all blah, blah to you. New to me. 2, use words that provoke emotion or enthusiasm. 3, give your audience a reason why they should take the desired action. And 4, take advantage of FOMO. And if anybody doesn't know what that is, we're really out of date. It's fear of missing out. So I did come up with 7 command verbs. I'm going to share them with you quickly, and then I will go back to all of them and tell you what I mean, and try to do it with words that provoke emotion and enthusiasm. And I'm going to try to give you a reason why you should take the desired action, and I'm not sure how to take advantage of FOMO. So the first call to the command verb, look up. 2, take aim. 3, speak clearly. 4, practice restraint explosively. 5, be filled with God. 6, embody intentional civics. And finally, learn to entertain. So look up. So we've been hypnotized by middle distance. You might know this. A number of years ago, many of you know the set designer John Conklin. He teaches at NYU, and he was. We have a class with Columbia graduate directors and NYU graduate designers. And I noticed that John was constantly yelling at his set designers when they were looking at a model box. He'd say, "Why are you standing at mid-distance? Get up close or move far away." And when I heard him say that, I thought that's great for directors too, that in a sense we're ambushed or we're held captive by middle distance. And I started thinking, actually middle distance is like CNN or Fox News. You kind of get hypnotized. You can't actually be useful, or you can't see clearly when you're mid-distance. And so one of the things we have to do in this call to action is we have to move up, get close, get intimate, or move back, telescope. And you know, I was brought up as an Episcopalian, and it turns out I learned the etymology of Episcopalian, episcope. It means to watch over, the idea of witnessing. And it seems to me that witnessing in this day and age is of vital importance. I would propose to you that this is also not new to anyone, that we have been, in a sense, swallowed up by distraction in social media. And rage can be so dangerously satisfying to us. And it's also treacherously entertaining. The issue is, in order to look up, to look away from one's device, to look up, to step back, to step forward, is that you also have to look up with hope, and that hope in difficult times is necessary. Resistance requires optimism. It might be the same thing. When we look up, we have to understand that what we choose to emphasize will determine our lives and the lives of others. So it's not enough just to look up, but it's also about how you look. If we only see the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. Gratitude gives the energy to act. So it's again, in between looking down and looking up, the mechanism that has to come into play is key, in a sense. It's important not to wait till things get better. This is the moment now. Live now as we think humans should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us. And that, in a sense, is a form of victory. Pessimists and pessimism, which is what we're attracted to when we get rageful, is this easy rage that we're all prey to. Pessimists, on the other hand, tend to believe in tribalism, racism, conflict, xenophobia, authoritarianism, segregation, and the need for military might. Noam Chomsky said it beautifully. He said, the choice between optimism and despair is really no choice at all. What's important as one looks up is to look for where the opportunities are. What in this moment it becomes visible as opportunities. You've probably heard Michael Moore. I used to not be a fan, and now I'm a fan. I think I got depressed when he predicted the last election, and then what he's been saying ever since, which I think he's right, he says, those who are not politicians need to run for office now. And I think he's right. And then a couple of weeks ago, I was having coffee with a young, very talented director who's worked here, I'm not going to name names, who wanted, she'd gone through the Columbia program, okay, I'm still not naming names, and we were having coffee, and she said she wanted career advice. And I found myself saying to her, wait, you want career advice about whether you should teach or maybe work as a freelance? I said with vehemence, I said, there are now more artistic director openings now than any time in my lifetime. There are more theaters, large and small, across this country who are looking for leadership. This is the time for, this is what running for office is for a theater person. It's time for young directors, certainly, to step into those shoes, to take responsibility, to face boards, face communities, go to the Elks in the library and talk about the theater, to actually start working on civic action. And that's the kind of looking up that we need to do. Not looking up towards me, but looking up towards outside. This is my, what is it called again? Command verb. Command verb number 2. take aim. It was, the director, he's actually Italian, but he's worked in Denmark for the last 50 years or something, Eugenio Barba. He asked the question, he's an anthropologist / director. He asked the question, what is it that all theater people have in common, even if they don't speak the same language or use the same gestures? He was thinking about actors. And he actually came up with an idea and a word for what it is that actors around the world share before they speak or gesticulate. Those are cultural things. And he called it, it's Danish, the word is sats, which literally, if anybody knows Danish, I don't, means the moment before action. And it is a quality of energy that happens before you act. I've understood it, although I know nothing about archery, but this example seems to be the most useful. If you're an archer, it's the moment before you release the arrow, boom, that the success of what you're doing is dependent on the moment before you release it. Do you understand? That notion of thoughts or attention or how you prepare yourself to act is more important than the action itself. The success of an action on stage is determined by that moment just before. It could be before a gesture, before an action, what have you. And I think the notion of attention and this notion of sats, when we say take aim, so we look up, we take aim. Attention is not logic. And that's important to understand. It's not reasons why to do something. It's a quality of attention. The quality of attention matters. You probably know, Aristotle said that the job of the theater, one of it is to create catharsis. And it turns out etymologically very interesting that catharsis means to shed light in dark places. That's interesting, that we, in a sense, need to do that, is to look up and turn our attention to things that are not being attended to, taking aims. We are, as human beings, we are we are prediction machines, and we are built to, comes from from genealogy, we're built to see what we're looking for. And so it matters what you're looking for when you take aim. For this reason, it's vital to be clear about where we are aiming and what we are aiming for. It matters how you see yourself in relationship to where you're aiming. And what I would propose to you is to see oneself as interdependent, not independent, but interdependent. You become what you look at, in a sense. As you take aim, think of yourself as a world citizen. How do you do that? How do you adjust your aim from looking up, taking aim, to thinking of yourself as a world citizen? Then in that moment, you have to actually compress before you express. We learned that from Martha Graham, that it's, again, a way of creating action. You don't just act. You actually take in the world and you compress. And from that kind of, I've been on a lot of planes lately. You know how the plane is on the tarmac, and just before it takes off, it revs, and then it boom, takes off. It's that revving that has to happen before action. That we tend to, in this particular culture we share, is to act before we compress. And that action is actually useless. It's also called complaint. So compress and express. The complaint actually wastes energy. You want to use energy. Store the frustration. Store the unhappiness. Don't let it make you sick, but use it as fuel. You want to cook it, and then you put it out. And the most important thing then, undertaking, is that as soon as you do that, then you have to adjust. Otherwise, you're being inflexible. So you take aim, and then you get feedback. As you're doing that, you are a witness. It's important for all of us to be a witness. Beware of wishful seeing, because we are prediction machines. We have to understand how we function. An aim, an ambition, provides the structure necessary for action. Without an aim, we swim. But in a sense, we need to create an aim, or else we don't have the structure for action. An aim provides a destination, a point of contrast against the present, and a framework within which it's possible to think and evaluate. An aim defines progress and makes engagement exhilarating. Without an aim, everything can mean anything or nothing. An aim reduces the anxiety of no meaning. The play that takes place on this stage, I don't want to ruin it for people who are seeing it tomorrow, is about a group of people who can't aim. And that's part of the tragedy of their situation. I won't give anything more away, since you'll see it in Les's beautiful direction. But what's necessary is to aim at your target with your eyes open. You have a direction, and then this is key, it might be wrong. We have to understand that. We aim, we shoot, and then, well, recognize that it might be wrong. We have to adjust. You might have a plan, but you also have to agree that it might be misguided. You may have been led astray by your own ignorance. Adjust. So aim and adjust. Point number 3. What is it called? Command verb. Speak clearly. Am I alone in my admiration of the students from Parkland? You know, 2 weeks ago I was in Croatia. I've never been in Croatia, way over there in Eastern Europe. And I was having a meeting with a group of Croatian speaking and Italian speaking actors from the National Theater there. And we talked for a long time, and at a certain point, and I was talking in English, I said, because they speak English, I don't speak Croatian. Anyway, and I said at some point, I said, do you want to talk about the politics in my country? And they said, yeah. And this woman, this Croatian woman said, Emma Gonzalez! I was so moved that she said Emma Gonzalez. Way the hell over there in Eastern Europe. What that describes is the power of words and the power of finishing sentences. And I think the disease that we suffer in this country is the inability to finish sentences. And finishing sentences is actually politically dangerous, which is why we have been encouraged not to. Speak up, as they say, tell the truth, speak the truth to power. I do think that artists have to learn to speak more persuasively, to be more persuasive. You know, the most beautiful definition of theater I have ever heard or read was written by Paul Woodruff, the philosopher, in a wonderful book called The Necessity of Theater. And he wrote, the theater is the art form wherein human beings make human action worth watching within a certain time and space. It's an extraordinary idea. And I would propose the art form wherein human beings make human action worth watching, that human action is also human speaking. What makes it hearable? That if there's anything we have to do is go back to that basic notion of watchability, of hearability. I would propose that the words we choose matter. I won't go into great detail because this is a long night, but we name our theater companies wrong. The word, and this is not an original thought, it was originally thought by Jan Whitehead, the wonderful Jan Whitehead, where she said, why do we call ourselves non-profit? That's like walking up and saying, hi, I'm non. Or she said, what about the word, and those of you in the room that understand this will really understand it, unearned income. Excuse me, but unearned income, that is the most earned income you I wanted to take her thinking further, and I started thinking about the way we describe ourselves in the theater. And it even started with how we name our theater companies, and I won't go into too many of them. But they're, you know, we tend to name our theater like On a String Theater Company. You know, it's almost like saying Not Dangerous Theater Company. Collapsible Bamboo, you know, like. You know what I'm talking about. I'm not going to. But you know, I always loved that this young group of Skidmore College students moved to New York. They went to Brooklyn, got a little tiny space, and they called their theater the National Theater of the United States of America. There's something about Emma Gonzalez in that. It's just, you know, I love that they did that, and that's in a way the way we need to adjust. So in speaking clearly, the words we matter, the words that we use in rehearsal matter. I think we should excise the word want. You know, the rehearsal, no, I want you to move downstage. Or an actor to a director, is this what you want? That sets up a child-parent relationship, which is never interesting. It's like, what does the play want? I mean, what I want is a little obscene and has nothing to do with the play. Words find order in chaos. What happens when one person stands up, or one group, and suddenly makes it possible to say something that could not have been previously said? I would say it's the way the Parkland students stood up. I once did, years and years ago, did a production of Danton's Death by Buchner, and you know this, it's just a bunch of speeches given during the French Revolution. Great play. And it was with young students, young acting students at NYU, as I said, 100 years ago. And I asked them each to stand up, because in order to perform this play, they needed to know the power of speech, is to create a speech about something they believed in and speak it to their fellow actors as a very beginning rehearsal technique. It was groundbreaking. They had never been asked to do that. And I think the reason we haven't been asked to speak has to do with something, I won't go into it now, that goes back to the McCarthy era. That politics and art have been separated in a way, as has the efficacy of action. But in fact, we come from a country that was founded on the principle of a declaration of independence. That in order to be free, you have to start by declaring it. And that act of declaration suddenly wakes up other people in the room to say, oh, right, that's what I was thinking too, but I didn't dare say it in public. You know, years ago, Joanne Akelitis, the wonderful director Joanne, when she had little kids, she was working a lot in the regional theaters around the country. And I know that she went into the Guthrie and she looked around and she said, where's childcare? And we were like, there's no childcare here. She said, well, how can you have a theater without childcare? And she made a big stink of it. And apparently in many theaters that then started having childcare sections in their theater. And apparently all the people who worked in the theater would come up to Joanne and say, thank you for saying something about childcare. Necessary. Speaking up. The question is, how do we raise the level of public discourse above the tabloid level? That's the question. I would propose one of the biggest ways we can do it is to understand the difference between conversation and debate. And the art of conversation just might save us. And I'm thinking of the Latin definition of, or etymology of conversation, converse, which is, in a sense, to turn with. And John Cage loved conversations because he always felt that by the end of the conversation he had switched places with the person he was speaking with. And that notion of being able to converse, or the art of conversation, I think is key. What are we doing? I keep forgetting what it's called. Command verbs. Practice restraint, and then I have in parentheses, explosively. You know, I listened recently to an interview with the wonderful Leonard Cohen, the composer, singer, just before he died. And some of you might have heard this interview. And at some point, the interviewer asked him both about the fact that he slept with a lot of women and about his Buddhism. And he said, and he was really close to death at this point, he said, actually, you know, people think that I spend a lot of time bedding women, but in fact, I'm on my hands and knees in a monastery cleaning the floor. And the interviewer said, well, with all these years of Buddhist study, what did you learn? And Leonard Cohen took a beat and said, not to whine, which I thought was so gorgeous as a summation. As I mentioned before, together we have created a culture of trigger-ready outrage and complaint. We are complicit in the social media frenzy. The public arena has become one of outrage. The anger and easy rage entertain us. The attraction of Trump was that people wanted someone to articulate their rage for them. They were titillated and enraptured by our own righteous cries. Whatever your complaint is, one tends to get a, what do they call it, a dopamine surge when you complain or when you feel rage. It feels good for a moment. But the problem is that as human beings, we are fragile, we are vulnerable. Our fragility and the vulnerabilities of the brain are the object of Silicon Valley. A great deal of research and expense is dedicated to ensuring that our devices are addictive and compelling as possible. The German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk talks about rage banks, which is his term for the way that disparate grievances can be organized into larger reserves of political capital. In other words, we are vulnerable, our rage is being used against us, we have to be careful. But I would propose that outrage and screaming and whining solve nothing. The practice of restraint is necessary now more than ever, both in our art and in our life of action. And we know that art is value that has restraint, that is explosive but also has restraint, that doesn't give it away. I think it's the Japanese notion of tamaru, which means feel 10, show 7, which is a beautiful, it's a technique for acting. What we need to do is avoid expediency, cynicism, and sarcasm. We need to avoid random complaint. We need to not waste precious energy on complaint and discharge, because discharge is the opposite of restraint, actually. Gather and restrain so that ultimately expression is eloquent and effective. As an artist, you know that when you want to speed up, this is the moment to slow down. How do we do this? We all get revved up. How do we actually slow down in that moment? You know, it was what the singer Katie Lang learned from Roy Orbison. She actually could say it. She watched him, and she changed by watching him. She learned what she called physical containment and emotional expansion, which for an actor is amazing. Physical containment and emotional expansion. So, how to live in a world where public discourse has become a toxic soup? Practice restraint. Oh damn! What is it called again? Command verb. Right. Thank you. Okay. Embody intentional civics. A couple of weeks ago, I gave a talk at the New School, and I was talking about the politics and art. And at some point, this young undergrad put up his hand, a guy named Elliot Wapples, and he said, Anne, would you consider using the word civics rather than politics? And we had a little discussion about it. I thought that was interesting, and then he emailed me, and he went further, because between the time he said that and he emailed me, I looked up civics to try to get a good definition. There was nothing satisfactory. But he wrote me in an email and he said, for him, civics is not, this is interesting, so follow me on this. I know it's been a long day. Civics does not attend to the psychology of people, but attends to the space between people. between the space between a person and a group, or space between people. And he said that he wanted to actually go to graduate school and study intentional civics, which I looked up, and there is no such thing. So I say to him, good luck finding somebody to teach it to you. But fantastic, he taught me something. Intentional civics. That what matters now is how we take care of the space between us and other people. And that matters in this particular political and cultural moment we're in. It might be true that what's happening to us right now, because we're a little bit like frogs who are, you know, the frog where the water gets heated, and the frog dies because it's being heated slowly. I would propose that we're getting less civically minded with one another. That that the people are being less generous with one another because it's being permitted. A certain abuse in the way of speaking. But the thing that's extraordinary about the theater is that what defines the theater from any other art form, from dance or visual arts or architecture, is that theater asks the question always, how are we getting along? And how can we get along better? That is the part, every great play asks that, whether it's Oedipus or Death of a Salesman. It's always about a group of people whose social system is falling apart and their attempt to come back into a state of harmony from a state of disharmony. And that struggle is what the dramatic action is. But I would propose to you that that is not only the subject of the theater, it's a little bit like theater and its double, is that every time you go to the theater, you're watching two plays. One is the story. So you can come out afterwards, your prefrontal cortex is taken in the story of the guy who kills his father and sleeps with his mother and goes mad. That's interesting, But there's another story which is happening, which is received on a more ancient part of the brain, which is how are these actors getting along? How do they respond to one another? You can feel it, you know it, you feel it in your mirror neurons. As an audience, you can sense what sort of social system they've created. But not only how are the actors getting along, how is the audience getting along? That's a subject in the room. How are we getting along? Not only that, but how is the audience and the actors getting along? An incredibly rich source of contextual storytelling, which is happening. And you come out with a very, many sets of stories, both consciously and unconsciously. And this, in a sense, is the subject of the theater. What we need to do in order to practice intentional civics is we need to listen to one another. And listening is actually dangerous, because if you actually listen well enough, you might be wrong and you might be changed, which is a kind of discomfort, and you have to actually embrace that discomfort. What I want to propose is that what we do in the civic realm affects the cultural realm. How we handle the space between us matters. What our job is to do in the theater is nothing less than to propose model societies, to propose ways that people might get along together. And that happens in the rehearsal. It happens with the politics of a rehearsal, how the creative act happens. And you know, revolutions happen in small rooms. I propose to you that a chorus line would never have happened without Joe Chaikin and the Open Theater doing their work. And I'm sure Michael Bennett went and watched those productions, and suddenly we have a brand new dramaturgy which comes into the world, which is about the individuals on the stage. That came out of the work of the Open Theater in the 60s. The way that we work together in the rehearsal room models. Okay, next, Commander. I have a block. I think I don't like the marketing technologies. It goes like this: be filled with God. So the best way I can approach this is a little story, which is I like going to dinner parties, and I went to a dinner party a number of years back. And I was seated next to a guy who was introduced as an architect. And I thought, I was excited because I'm an amateur architect fan. Architecture fan. Anyway, I was sitting next to him, and at some point I turned to him and I said, "Oh gosh, it must be wonderful, you're an architect." And he said, "Actually, no, I used to be, I'm not anymore." I said, "How could you leave architecture?" I mean, and I started listing all my favorite architects. And he said, "All those people that you mentioned, they have something I don't have." And I said, "What?" He said, "Enthusiasm." And what he means is that, and he said, is that people who pay for buildings have to pay a lot of money. And they don't hire people who are not filled with the love of the art form of architecture. Now it turns out, and I think this is instructive, that the etymology of the word enthusiasm means to be filled with God, entheo. And the notion of our job is actually to take care of the situation so that we are constantly filled with enthusiasm. And every one of us in the room knows how horrible it feels to fake enthusiasm. It's a horrible fake feeling. So to cultivate actual enthusiasm that then is contagious, and I love and hate that all of the words are about diseases. So like influence is influenza, or it goes viral, virus. Disease, dis-ease, we cultivate the dis-ease. All these things are actually positive and negative. But how do we actually create the sort of influenza, the influence, or through dis-ease? The notion of viral excitement, because we don't end at where our bodies end. We affect other people with our own enthusiasms. Now, with enthusiasm, you cultivate it, and as I said before, and temper it with restraint. Cultivate enthusiasm, temper it with restraint. And then create what I think is probably the most important thing we can do in the theater is to create resonance. Like, what is it that is a resonant experience on the stage? Resonant in the sense that it resounds in your own body as you watch it. You know, like Hamilton has created resonance in the world. Why is that? I won't answer that question. Resonance, the word comes from Latin and means to resound or to sound together. In physics, resonance denotes a vibrating system or external force that drives one another to oscillate at greater amplitude. That's what we have to do, exactly that. I don't know about you, but I find myself in the last year and a few months going to the theater, and it sounds horrible, but I'm either saying yes or no. Like, this is not necessary, this I need. And it seems more, I know that sounds intolerant, but it's clearer and clearer when the theater is creating resonance, and is creating resonance within me, and it relates to the lens of the particular world we're living in. It doesn't always have to be literally about the world we're living in, but the lens gives me access and resonance. And in order to be filled with God, to be filled with enthusiasm, this is no time for cynicism. And cynicism surrounds us. We need to offer an alternative, and that's our job and in our call to action. And I got it. Command verb next. Oh, this is the last one. Learn to entertain. The role of patience and the weapon of humor. I don't know if you share with me in the last months, does anybody else here watch with relief and interest Trevor Noah, Stephen Colbert, Bill Maher, Samantha Bee? Humor helps, humor cuts through. You know, I used to work a lot with the producer Annie Hamburger, who had Encore Arts. She did site-specific before it was site-specific was a thing. And the reason I would work with her repeatedly is we would get into horrible messes in the early days. you know, the police would want to shut down the site, or the fire department would come, whatever. And why I would always work with Annie is because when it got really bad, she laughed. And how can we, in terms of the call to action, cultivate the ability to do that, to use our theater, our lives as a cutting tool, but also to laugh at the same time. Now, it seems like I want to propose that we re-own the word entertainment. It's long been associated with amusement and gratification, but we can shift perspectives to find richer meanings and uses for entertainment. So the etymology of entertainment, I know, this is like the 19th etymology. I'm an etymology nerd. Enter, from Latin, means inside. Tain is to grasp, and mente is the mind. So it is the idea of grasping in between. The word suggests the mental state of entering, holding, or grasping between or inside. What it means is two and not one. What it means is being able to live in the space between oppositions. Chuck Nee uses the best analogy that's visual. If you think of a light bulb, the light and the electricity is not caused by itself. It's caused by the tension between, oh, I forgot what they're called, filaments. The filaments, two filaments, and it's the opposition of the filaments that actually cause the electricity and therefore the light. So to be able to entertain an idea means that I have to hold an idea, maintain it in the mind, and simultaneously float it with other ideas. This interaction engenders engagement, and this engagement or encounter constitutes a real experience. So the notion of opposite, you have to keeping multiple ideas in mind at the same time. How one person entertains another. To entertain requires the collaboration between the storyteller and an audience, using tools that have been developed over thousands of years, specifically for the purpose of capturing and sustaining an audience's attention. In order to entertain effectively, you have to resist certainty. I read something that my dear friend Cherry Jones said. Somebody in some reporter asked her to comment about Woody Allen, and she said something extraordinary, which I wrote down. She said, and I quote, "There are those who are comfortable in their certainty. I am not. I don't know the truth. When we condemn by instinct, our democracy is on a slippery slope." So the notion of holding something and living in a state of in-between is tricky. To appreciate a work of art, both as the creator and the audience, needs to be able to entertain multiple ideas simultaneously. And so for us is to fabricate a world where it's possible to think about the world and about ourselves in productive, insightful, and even entertaining ways. Using the most basic example in the theater of entertainment is that audiences, first of all, know that what they're seeing is fiction, but simultaneously allow themselves to respond to it emotionally and empathically as if it were real. So right away you have entertainment, but entertainment happens down the road. There's a very famous Sanskrit saying about the theater, ancient Indian saying. It says, theater should do three things simultaneously. One, it should entertain the drunk. At the same time, it should answer how to live. At the same time, it should answer, how does the universe work? I don't know, there's 5, 6, 7, 8 right now. The dramatic form is the art in which perspectives are brought into collision. This can be a powerful antidote to the sophistry and sensationalism nullifying our capacity for intelligent debate. Picasso called art the lie that tells the truth. In an era of fake news, We are creating fictional journeys that can help to develop within us an understanding that truth is an inquiry. Not all frauds are created equal. And finally, motives count. Thank you very much.